Okay, I think we're going to get started. Welcome to the Nossiter Lecture. I'm Alexis Jetter. I teach journalism in the English department here and also the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program. We're very lucky to have Bill Barrow as our guest today, national politics reporter for the Associated Press. Very timely visit. And I'll tell you more about Bill in a moment. First, I want to thank the Nossiter family for hosting this talk. Bernard Nossiter was a legendary foreign correspondent who graduated from Dartmouth in 1947 and went on to a remarkable career at the Washington Post and the New York Times. One of his sons, Adam Nossiter, is a name you might recognize, also a longtime foreign correspondent for the New York Times, working as bureau chief in Kabul, Paris, West Africa, and the New York Times, New Orleans, I mean. Every year, the Nossiter family selects a journalist in residence at the Nieman Foundation, a one-year program at Harvard that invites leading journalists from around the world to spend 1 year on campus, doing essentially anything they like. You're taking archaeology, but it's also a chance to really dig into some research, stuff they haven't had a chance to work on because they've been, being a reporter. So I want to turn to Bill here and introduce him. We are lucky to have him here today to help us navigate some of the stunning changes in the U.S. political landscape in just the last few days. Bill is, as I said, a national political correspondent for the Associated Press. He covered the Biden campaign in 2020, and he covered Democrats during the Trump presidency, but he's not moored to Washington, D.C., and that's, I think, what makes Bill really interesting. He was born and raised in Alabama, and he's worked for newspapers across the South, often looking at how people outside the corridors of power are affected by seismic changes, natural and man-made. After Hurricane Katrina decimated Louisiana, he looked at how the healthcare system was rebuilt. In Alabama, he probed the corruption of the former governor. He won the George Polk Award, which is sort of the sine qua non award for investigative reporting, for his series, it was with other people, but his series on predatory lending by banks in the South. Bill, as you'll hear, is concerned about the tendency of news organizations to see the political convulsions in this country in simple terms, red versus blue. I mean, of course, that's tempting. The political map could hardly be more striking. But that misses really critical distinctions that can blind reporters to underlying trends within traditional voting blocks. As Bill will talk about in a minute, that color-coded mindset led journalists to overlook shifts in working class allegiances in the industrial Midwest, and I would add, in the attitudes of Latinx voters in the Southwest toward immigration and voting patterns among white women voters. And the only way to do that is to spend more time in towns and cities across the U.S. rather than the bell jar of Washington, D.C. And here, I did make this crack earlier today, but I'm going to make it again. I had to laugh when I saw Bill's write-up for this talk in which he castigated Sports Center brand of journalism, because when I checked out his Twitter account, and granted, you're off duty this year, pretty much all he wrote about was football, specifically Auburn University in Alabama, his alma mater, which colors are arguably red and blue, but kind of on the orange side. Anyway, it's my pleasure to introduce Bill to Dartmouth, and for those who are live streaming this, if you want to contribute questions, just email rockyqa@dartmouth.edu. And people who have questions in the television audience, there'll be a microphone and you'll ask them. Okay, thanks. Thanks, Bill.
I'm going to try this with this high podium. This is when I wish I were 6 feet tall. But thank you, Alexis.
You're welcome.
And thank you to the Nossiter family, to the faculty and leaders of the Rockefeller Center, and especially to the students who were here and those that I got to talk to earlier today. It's so fun to get to visit with undergraduates and listen to their curiosity and see their views of the world. Though it's a little scary when I visit campuses now, and having been on Harvard this year, because I'm doing the math and realize that I am actually now old enough to be the parents of undergraduates. My children are 10 and 6. They're not there yet, but it's still a little unnerving. So it's popular these days to say that American democracy is in peril and that journalism is lurching somewhere between existential crisis and just meandering chaos. But it's not productive for me to come here and be Chicken Little with you today, because I think saying the sky is falling too easily absolves us from having to do the hard work of fixing what the problems are on the ground. And we are in a critical juncture in American journalism and self-government. But I believe a more nuanced take is necessary to meet the moment. If there's one idea I hope you leave with today, it's this: that nuance and complexity are not the enemies of good journalism or healthy public discourse. In fact, nuance and complexity are foundations of a well-functioning democracy. So let's set the stage. The United States is in an era of hyperpartisanship. Political tribalism isn't new, but we have seen a rise in negative partisanship and a related drop in split-ticket voting and the number of true independents that are engaging. We see increasingly clean corollaries between a voter's preferred partisan identity and what they think about so many other issues and cultural divides. Americans' trust in institutions and in each other is falling. The internet has changed information flow, the journalism business model, and the ways that Americans see themselves and each other, and the way we talk to each other. The colonial and constitutional sin of chattel slavery is again in the forefront. Now, institutional racism has always lived in our systems, but now we see more white Americans confront this reality. And its accompanying truth that our democracy isn't really 246 years old. Our democracy is barely a half century old, birthed in the Civil Rights Movement. Over this same span, demographic and settlement shifts now leave us more urban, less descendant of Western Europe, and more religiously pluralistic than we have ever been. And in this economy, younger generations are less economically mobile than their parents, and we have income and wealth gaps reminiscent of the Gilded Age. Now, none of these circumstances is completely distinct from the others. There may not always be a clean chain of cause and effect, but it is indisputable that our politics, policies, our social structures, and our conversations about them are inextricably linked. Now, that in and of itself is not a profound observation. In academia, this truth is what gives us the concept of the liberal education, the core curriculum. In journalism, this became the general interest magazine, the Metropolitan Daily newspaper, the Evening News, all seeking to capture, in theory at least, a wide-angle view of the world, or what NPR still calls all things considered. But today, dominant narratives about U.S. politics, in my view, are often oversimplified. Our national conversation is framed first and foremost as a tug-of-war between two parties, an us versus them screaming match between competing bands of citizens. You've heard of the phrase horse race journalism. The phrase originates in criticism of campaign reporting, but I would say it's expanded into a model of constant scorekeeping. It shapes daily coverage of our politicians from the time they launch a campaign to when they're elected, sworn in, and declare to run again, and then the cycle repeats. There are added elements of red carpet journalism that you would see at any awards show in Hollywood. You may know that quip that Washington, D.C. is Hollywood for ugly people. Some of our journalism apparently missed the joke. At its most shallow, our work can meet at the intersection of People magazine, the sports ticker on ESPN, and the stock ticker on CNBC. Now, let me say that there is thoughtful, thorough reporting produced every day, and discerning citizens can find it. But I'm talking about the central threads in what we recognize as political journalism, the coverage of campaigns and government, the power players and what they're doing and what it means. My critique is demonstrated neatly in the fact that we've assigned jersey colors to Republicans and Democrats. It's as if two teams have fielded this harmless game of democracy. And the people in the stands aren't actually a part of the game. They're just rooting on teams unaffected by the outcome other than for bragging rights. And we extend these qualifiers to whole states, whole regions, and we use them to explain entire complex issues. Now, this is just so obviously reductive, singularly reductive. But cumulatively, over time, it becomes part and parcel with that us versus them framing. This seemingly innocuous labeling exacerbates, or I think at least passively reinforces, these divides that are fraying American institutions, including ours. Mr. Pulitzer and Mr. Hearst gave us the yellow journalism era. We are answering more than a century later with what I will call the red-blue journalism era. Now, I should explain that as an employee of the Associated Press, I'm bound by rules that limit how I can criticize other journalism organizations and other journalists by name. So I will tread lightly there, and I won't mention individuals at all. Still, I think I can make the case quite simply because red-blue journalism is so omnipresent. We see it in the primetime lineups of cable news networks that have unabashedly ideological identities. Some even traffic propaganda. And beyond those most extreme examples, it's long been a feature of television, even public television, to present news using so-called balanced panels of paid partisans. Twitter is dominated by political brass, journalists, and activists, and they take their collective noise as representative of the whole. This, despite the fact that 3/4 of American adults don't use the medium at all. Facebook algorithms further concentrate and magnify Americans' chosen echo chambers. And opinion journalism, even if soundly argued, populates prime slots on legacy media homepages. And even more so, their curated feeds on platforms like Apple News Plus. Now, it's easy for text reporters like me to make lists like these as if we aren't part of the problem. But we and our editors are in this too. We're on Twitter talking to and listening to each other. We produce stories that are indistinguishable in their frame from the actual horse racing previews you would have read last week before the Kentucky Derby. And by the way, those stories proved useless. The winner was an 80-to-1 long shot that was a replacement for a Friday scratch. Horse race journalism is never a compliment. Here's a sampling of headlines over the last month. They come from legacy institutions, print orgs, and newer but well-established national platforms and some of the networks. 2022 forecast, ratings, predictions, and key races. What do the midterms mean for Joe Biden? Republicans are favored to win the Senate in 2022. Here's how the Democrats can stop them. Couldn't Roe fire up Democrats the way Joe Biden hasn't? Trump flexes and the center shrinks. Primary takeaways. Trump passes kingmaker test in Ohio. In the last week, you've seen this trend magnified in Washington datelines and Twitter threads and cable segments on the leak of the Supreme Court's draft opinion that would overturn Roe v. Wade. The draft itself, meanwhile, portends a seismic ruling that, whatever the merits, would objectively roll back constitutional rights for the first time since Reconstruction courts chipped away at the 14th Amendment after it was ratified in 1868. But in all this noise, there is good news, or at least a better way for news. Political journalists can reclaim nuance. We can acknowledge the complexities in a country with 330 million inhabitants. And we can engage directly with policy and the people those policies affect. At its highest ideal, journalism's calling is to be society's mirror. Honoring that means reflecting more than a body politic made of irreconcilable poles. That image is just a funhouse distortion. It is our job to find the wrinkles, the contradictions, the complications. And then we must show those layers, however counterintuitive, to a disparate electorate so that that electorate can wrestle with itself, its full self. I want to offer a 4-step strategy toward that end. It starts first with how we define the country. That bleeds into changing how we see the country. Third, we must address how we position ourselves throughout the country as journalists, quite literally who we hire, where we put them. And then those steps accumulate into a more nimble and layered way to gather and present the news. Step 1 is simple. Stop using red and blue as objective modifiers. Now, this may strike some of you as trifling over syntax. The labels grew harmlessly out of television's desires to depict the Electoral College on presidential election nights. But convenience isn't the same as necessity. Uniformity in this practice didn't even develop until the first Bush era. And it wasn't until the disputed 2000 election between Al Gore and George W. Bush that the phrases red states and blue states became a permanent part of the lexicon. And 2 decades after that, it's morphed into what we have today, conversations about red America and blue America. So quick, is Vermont red or blue? Vermonters have elected Bernie Sanders, a Democratic socialist, for 30 years. The governor is a Republican. Governor Scott gets 70% approval ratings. Massachusetts has given us the Kennedy dynasty and now Elizabeth Warren, but it's led by a popular Republican governor, Charlie Baker. And it was one of Baker's Republican predecessors, some guy named Mitt Romney, you've probably heard of him, who signed into law the health insurance overhaul that became the blueprint for Democrats' Affordable Care Act in 2010. California steers its electoral college votes to Democrats reliably, but President Trump's popular vote there numbered 6 million. That is more than the entire populations in 30 states. 30. Speaker Nancy Pelosi, a Democrat, hails from San Francisco, from liberal California. But so does Kevin McCarthy, the Republican House leader who may or may not succeed her as Speaker. In Kentucky, voters send Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell to Washington. They've elected Andy Beshear, a Democrat, as governor, and they elected his father twice before him. President Trump won Louisiana by 20 points, but the state's second-term governor is a Democrat, John Bel Edwards. And Beshear in Frankfurt and Edwards in Baton Rouge expanded Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act, at the same time that their state's Republican senators had voted repeatedly to repeal that law. And as it turns out, the electorates in their states that elected all of those officials seem fine with the change. And so do, as a matter of fact, the state hospital associations, the nursing home associations, and the state chambers of commerce in Louisiana and Kentucky. You see, in newsrooms, we like to say we keep it simple, and I've heard this defended as we're just covering conflict, but that doesn't justify misrepresentation. And these labels, beyond being lazy, are so devoid of context as to become inaccurate. AP, which sets the standard for word usage in journalism, could take the lead here, I believe, by forswearing red and blue. Our organization has bucked ubiquitous rhetoric before. We do not allow in our copy stories on abortion the phrases pro-life and pro-choice, deeming them to be propagandish. One simply supports abortion rights or opposes abortion rights. Similarly, in covering politics, we could simply state whether a state legislature or congressional delegation is majority Democratic or dominated by Republicans. We could explain in neutral language a state's voting trends in recent elections. And a move by AP, I think, would almost force wider conversations among standards editors and others at leading newspapers, magazines, and networks. And more importantly, it could have ripple effects within all of our newsrooms. And that becomes the second step, sharpening how we see the country. If we didn't accept the idea of Democrats' blue wall in the Rust Belt in 2016, might we have spent more resources on the ground reporting and talking to voters in those states and better understood what was coming and why? Let Michiganders and Wisconsinites and Ohioans explain their views and their votes. We repeated some of these sins in 2020, especially in the Democratic primary. The South, where I come from, is Republican red, right? Ruby red Texans, you will hear. That's a favorite phrase I see. In presidential primaries, though, the more complicated truth is that the region holds determinative influence in both parties' nominating process. Now, I know that's a little dangerous to say in New Hampshire, a little risky. I don't think Bill Gardner is here, but stick with me. In recent decades, Republicans who ran Southern state houses pushed up their primaries to give conservatives an earlier say in choosing nominees. But what that also did is give Southern Democrats, a group now dominated by black Democrats and white moderates, similar influence in their party. Joe Biden's campaign said as much to anyone who would listen in 2019, but much of the coverage of Biden focused on his clumsiness in the two early states and his struggles among progressives concentrated in coastal cities. Those narratives forgot that two things can be true. Biden was weak in Iowa and New Hampshire and among progressives. But, two, neither the overwhelmingly white voters of Iowa and New Hampshire nor the progressive factions in other places controlled enough delegates to derail Biden easily, if at all. And as it turned out, Biden went from presumed dead to presumptive nominee in a whiplash of weeks. Even now, the revised story asserts that black voters in South Carolina saved Biden's candidacy. I maintain that still misses the point. His candidacy was never as dead as his competitors. His campaign was never as dead, and his competitors were never as strong as the narrative suggested. Quite simply because a determinative swath of Democrats had not yet voted. And if you don't buy that determinative descriptor, let's Quickly revisit 2008 and 2016. Exit polls in 2008 show that Hillary Clinton won the cumulative white vote within the Democratic primary electorate nationally, but Barack Obama was the nominee. 8 years later, it was Bernie Sanders who won the cumulative Democratic white vote in all of those primaries, but Hillary Clinton won the nomination that time. Joe Biden took it to the extreme, finishing 4th in Iowa, 5th in New Hampshire, and still being the nominee. But the common thread was that in each case, the nominee swept the primaries from Virginia to Texas. A journalism example from 2015, that Sanders-Clinton campaign, you might recall this flurry of stories once it became apparent that Senator Sanders was for real. These stories about Hillary Clinton's supposed lack of appeal. It was an attempt to kind of correct the early coronation narrative. And every outlet did some version or multiple versions of the "why isn't Hillary beloved" stories. And especially common were stories that were hooked to union men and younger women. But there was a glaring absence in this approach. It was black women. But any reporter who spent time in South Carolina or Atlanta or Jackson, Mississippi or New Orleans could have told you and learned that Clinton was genuinely popular, even beloved among black women. This red-blue obsession backfires in so-called purple state coverage too. Every election cycle since 2000, donors, candidates, parties, third-party groups, and the media place an inordinate amount of resources in Florida, where we had that long fight to settle the 2000 presidential election. That makes it a de facto battleground, but its actual outcome since 2000 trend clearly in favor of Republicans. It's not much different than, say, North Carolina or Georgia in the same 20-year period. Now, I cannot draw a straight line from red-blue nomenclature to national media fumbling some of this approach, but I say with some confidence that my colleagues and our bosses in Washington and New York would have made different decisions if we'd thought more critically about the makeup of the full electorate. Now, the goal here, to be clear, isn't savvier analysis of what we see under the Washington spotlight or more accurate forecasting of elections. The goal is a clearer, wider reflection of what the country actually is, how it got to be this way, and what our options are going forward. There are infinitely rich stories to be told in every American state. Every profile of voter can be found in every state. And nearly every policy debate, every policy choice can be demonstrated in any state. Invariably, we will find more varied voices in more settings once we are required to think beyond shortcuts and drop those red and blue blinders. And that leads to step 3, reassessing how we distribute our resources, especially who we hire and where we base them. Local journalism has been gutted. Now, this doesn't mean Americans are consuming less news. It just means they're more dependent on news generated by journalists that live far away. It's a silver lining, perhaps, to see national papers and networks growing so. The New York Times has set a goal of 15 million subscribers by 2027. That is a staggering percentage of market share. That's an admirable goal, and the Times, along with the Washington Post, are several years into aggressive hiring. And that does include more positions based around the country. But that trend beyond Washington and New York must continue at those newsrooms and at the networks and among the relatively new proliferation of nonprofit organizations that are supported by philanthropy. But more parachute journalism, where you drop in from the outside, isn't the answer to declining local journalism. We need more journalism generated by people who are intimately familiar with the people and the places that they cover because they live there. And I'd submit the non-coastal job shouldn't be just for reporters. They should include more editors and producers and news directors who control budgets and make coverage decisions. And these newsroom leaders and the highest profile reporters that remain based in New York and Washington should move about the country even more than they do already. And I don't count here traveling on Air Force One or on a campaign charter. That's fun, but it's not the same as traveling away from the politicians who are trying to control the message. No one will notice if there are fewer reporters on Capitol Hill yelling questions or a few more empty seats in the press room of the West Wing. But people will notice better work from the field. Further, our hiring must reflect the country. Our industry is belatedly chipping away at the white patriarchy in newsrooms. But diversity considerations must go beyond race, ethnicity, and gender. Now, I know I'm poking the lion in her own den here, but a newsroom filled with graduates of elite private schools and a few of the most selective public universities will have blind spots. When those newsrooms are led by bosses with mid-six-figure incomes and in some places seven-figure incomes, you will have blind spots. And when the org chart is populated heavily by people from the nation's largest metro areas, you will have blind spots. Consider these numbers. The median household income in the United States is less than $75,000. 60% of Americans, even with our urbanization, 60% of Americans live in cities, towns, and communities with fewer than 50,000 residents. And 2/3 of US adults do not have a bachelor's degree, much less one from the Ivy League. The internship and fellowship coordinator at a national paper unexpectedly met this reality in recent years when he tweeted, harmlessly he thought, a list of schools that had produced the best journalists that he had accepted. He spent days explaining himself and apologizing amid the onslaught. Responders reminded him that there was a reason his and other newsrooms were so shocked on election night in 2016. I'd add here that organizations must continue increasing the bottom of their pay scales. You only exacerbate class and wealth blind spots when you cut off aspiring journalists who simply cannot afford to live where you want them to work. Pew Research has found a noticeable trend even in this tense era. People decide on their preferred media in part because of the individual journalists they trust. The dispiriting interpretation here is that all politics is identity politics of some kind or another. And I think it is. And that holds true to media consumption in some degree as well. But there's a softer interpretation that I think we must consider. Representation matters. It matters first for producing good journalism, but it also matters in maximizing audiences for that work. And these first three changes all combine to lead to the fourth, which is breaking down the silos in how we gather stories and how we tell them. I said earlier that there's so much good work done every day, and there is, but we put politics coverage in one bucket. And then we have policy reporters over here answering to another editor. And then we have agency reporters that might be kind of like policy reporters. And then there are investigative teams in one corner of the newsroom, and another corner might have the news feature writers that go around and find the real people, the vaunted real people stories. And we've added in recent years data teams and fact check teams and race and ethnicity teams. Now sometimes there is cross-team work, but we should have more regular cross-pollination. Ideas should be generated and encouraged among reporters, free from worries that their conversations will be taken as insubordination to the editor hierarchy. And I dare say that hierarchy can be quite territorial. And I think any of you who are faculty or retired faculty who pursued tenure and promotion within American academia can commiserate here. The result of this would be more layered final presentations, multi-format work that blends politics with policy and explanatory or investigative work that tells stories through the lives of people far from Capitol Hill, and work that weaves in the context of history at every stage. It is possible for this work to be the standard, not the exception. But all of those shifts require conscious choices by industry leaders who control resources and long-term strategy. Now think here of Donald Shaw and Maxwell McCombs and their agenda-setting theory of the 1970s. They built on earlier work by Walter Lippmann, who argued that the public, broadly speaking, sees the world as it is presented to them by the media. Shaw and McCombs analyzed campaign stories and compared it to changes and trends in public opinion polls to conclude that media narratives don't tell voters specifically what to think, but it shapes what issues voters think about and how much emphasis they place on them. I recall, too, an Iowa school teacher, Jane Elliott, and her famous annual experiments on racism and tribalism. Elliott divided her elementary students by eye color, imposing an arbitrary social hierarchy. And then she'd watch them devolve into prejudiced and discriminatory mini-societies, tracking those parameters she'd outlined. It's easy to confuse corollary with causation, but I think at the least, Shaw, McCombs, and Elliott would urge us to consider the overlap of this red-blue journalism era with the fragmenting and fraying of American society. I want to leave you this evening with the influence of two women. One is my mother, Carol Jean Barrow. She's a retired school teacher and preacher's wife in Alabama. The other is Zara Joya. She is the founder of Rukshana Media, an independent newsroom in Afghanistan. My mother has lived nearly all of her 75 years in Deep South small towns. Her accent would blend seamlessly onto the set of Steel Magnolias. Big cities don't suit her. It's too much bustle. She was educated at religious colleges, and she taught for decades in rural settings places where Donald Trump is a messianic figure. She's a Facebook and cable news regular. She attends church weekly, and she sometimes laments the state of the world. Now, according to our prevailing frame, my mother is a veritable matriarch of Red America. But here's the thing. She has cast 15 presidential ballots in her lifetime, and none of them for the Republican nominee. And if you ask her about the last one, your ears might wilt. I sometimes use Mama as a barometer for what narrative setters in my business and in politics assume about the country. I find ways to work her into conversations with colleagues and sources, and often enough to be damning. Those influencers and power brokers have greeted her story and her profile with surprise. Zara is nearly a half century younger than my mother. She's 29, but already has spent a lifetime fighting so that Afghan women, including herself, can have some hope of living out their full humanity, or at least have the dignity of asserting it. As a girl, she spent years posing as a boy because that was the only way that she was going to be educated. As an adult, she founded Rukshana. It's an online publication where she and other women tell the story of what it's like to live under Taliban rule. Zara is now in London, living in exile after the U.S. withdrawal and subsequent collapse of Kabul. Some of her colleagues remain in hiding back home as the Taliban cracks down on independent journalism, but they all continue to work. Our Neiman class honored Rukshana Media with an annual Harvard Award for conscience and integrity in journalism. Zara couldn't travel, but she visited with us online last week, and since that session, two things have just been ringing around in my head. She told us that her organization was named for a teenager who was caught fleeing a forced marriage. Rukshana was a 15-year-old girl stoned to death. And then there was Zara's entreaty to Western media. Please don't forget Afghanistan, she said. She meant it as a humble request, but it echoes for me as a charge to a privileged profession that holds great power and wields it in this country with great freedom and assurance, even in these uncertain times. I owe it to my mother to always remember her defiance of stereotypes and shortcuts as I try to tell America's story. I owe it to Zara to remember that I'm not sitting in a stadium press box, and that calling myself a politics reporter means that my job is to seek out all angles of the messy process by which we organize society. And all of us calling ourselves journalists are compelled to remember that this process carries consequences and that we must not define the outcomes purely by the electoral fortunes of those who walk marbled hallways. Rukshana's life was not a game. Neither is Zara's, and neither is any of ours. Thank you.
Okay, I guess I'm not muted. Thanks, Bill. That was really interesting and also really passionate. One thing you said toward the beginning really interested me. There's this whole dialogue going on right now among journalists, among feminists, among abortion rights activists. Did we blow it? This idea of pro-life versus pro-choice. Choice, of course, seems more shallow, less important than life. And there's been this whole dialogue about, well, what should people have called it? What you just said about being in favor of abortion rights or opposed to abortion rights. I mean, that's just a really, really good example. Of course, it doesn't give you the shorthand that people want, but I think that's really worth thinking about. So I have a bunch of questions for Bill, and then I want to open it up to you guys and also to people who are watching this on live stream. So Bill interests me for a bunch of reasons. One is that you've been following fast-changing political trends in this country for nearly 2 decades. You're an expert on Southern politics, and you know a lot about the new wave of voter suppression laws. So I wanted to start talking about Roe. It's really on everyone's minds. certainly on my mind. And I know you're taking this year off, but I'm sure you've been following things. So my first question is, do you think and this is not an original question, but I'll pose it anyway. Do you think the Supreme Court decision overturning Roe v. Wade, understanding that we have the draft and not the final, but it looks pretty clear, is going to be a decisive factor in the midterm elections? How could Democrats use it? What strategies do you think they're discussing right now? And in what ways are Republicans downplaying it?
Hey, that's a lot.
That's just one.
To be clear, I am still off. I haven't
Yeah.
talked to a lot of my Democratic Party sources to see what they're talking about behind closed doors. I mean, there's an immediate reaction in that the base that was already engaged on an issue like this is even more intensified, and that will give you volunteers and give you small dollar contributions that can have ripple effects in a campaign. So there is that. But my gut would say that when something like this comes out, that is going to be true on both ends. I don't know that anyone can reliably predict that one side is all of a sudden going to be more engaged than the other. In particular, because we have enough history that this issue from the 1980s, not actually from 1973, it's kind of a misrepresentation of history in Alito's draft that this was like such an immediate tempest in the 1970s. I mean, the 1970s were angst-filled for a host of other reasons. But in the 1980s is when kind of the moral majority and the white evangelical movement congealed as such a political force, and Reagan's presidency married the Republican Party machinery with that. And from that point forward, this has been a congealing, defining, driving issue on the right. I don't think that changes. I could see this intensifying that organizational potential on the left. The long-term question, and I don't even know if the results in November will really answer this, is what does this do to a younger generation of women who track, I think, with all younger voters, not being as partisan as parents and grandparents. They had not settled into, being a capital D Democrat, a capital R Republican. And I wonder if that will affect that alignment some. That will be interesting to watch, but I think one election is not enough to know the answer to that question.
You talked briefly about the 14th Amendment, and I was, some of the things people are concerned about is that because this decision sort of, loosens some civil rights from the 14th Amendment under due process and equal protection, some of the concern is that this decision will lead states to feel that they can challenge marriage equality, that they can challenge contraception. And the reason they could challenge contraception is that in Louisiana, for example, life is now being defined. And by the way, this is a state that has advanced a law, you probably know this, that would charge women with murder if they terminate their abortions. And now, because the definition of the start of life in Louisiana and in a lot of other state laws that are being considered is fertilization, okay? So that if you use a form of birth control that's emergency birth control or uses anything after the moment of fertilization, you can be charged with murder. And in Louisiana, and I'm going to bring this back to you, but just so that you know the ramifications here, Louisiana has a death penalty for murder. Now, it may not get that bad that fast, but the truth is, once you loosen up some of the constitutional weaving that has protected a number of civil rights going back 20, 30, 40, 50 years, anything's possible. And I just want, since you're familiar with the 14th Amendment and how it's been sort of utilized to expand rights, how could it be used now to withdraw those rights?
The quick answer, I am not a lawyer, but thanks to Neiman, I actually have taken one class at Harvard Law School, and it involves the 14th Amendment. So I'll see if Professor Lessig would be proud of me here. In short, rights have been expanded over time not as much under the Equal Protection Clause, and certainly not under the Privileges and Immunities Clause, which is the first part of the 14th Amendment and really has never been used. That was one of those things that the Reconstruction courts kind of gutted, and the court never went back and fixed that, so it's like it's not there. They used the Due Process Clause.
And privacy.
Yes, they connected, I mean, Roe and then Griswold before that, which was the birth control decision in the 60s, kind of connect the Ninth Amendment and due process for the idea of privacy with the Fifth Amendment, the search and seizures. But they developed this complicated analysis. If you've read some of these stories or watched enough of the right legal analysts on cable news, they talk about substantive due process. And they've just basically used the Due Process Clause as the cover for analyzing whether unenumerated rights, which are those that aren't expressly spelled out in the Constitution, rise to the level of constitutional protection. And the phrase that we've heard bandied about that comes from Alito's ruling, he didn't make this up, is that the test is something well enough established in the nation's history and traditions that an American walking around can presume that it's just a part of being an American to be able to do this. That's sort of the layman's, literally a non-lawyer's explanation as I understand it. And Alito is making a very certain argument, very clean line argument of no, abortion is not part of the nation's history and traditions because, and he points back to criminal statutes back as early as the colonies and the common law, and that's the argument there. And a lot of these other rights that we're talking about also are not enumerated. They were conferred by the court under this analysis of substantive due process in the 14th Amendment. Now, an interesting thing, and this is going far afield in kind of the legal argument, but I'll connect it to journalism and say an example of the kind of things I think we could do rather than just be reactionary, is to be more proactive, and a conversation in this realm that I think needs more attention, questions that need to be discussed more, is why isn't this an equal protection idea? Did any of you see it's gotten pulled out of his draft where he quotes Justice Ginsburg's criticisms of the legal reasoning in Roe and the court's timing in 1973? And he accurately quotes her. Justice Ginsburg was critical on those fronts. He did not say, of course, that she also vehemently supported the ultimate finding of Roe, but she would argue that the reasoning was wrong because the better reasoning is simply an equal protection under the law, that because this is so fundamental to a woman's ability, controlling reproductive rights is so fundamental to a woman's ability to control her own life, her own liberty, her body, her pursuit of happiness, all of those phrases that we throw around in constitutional law, that the government can't impose a restriction that there is no corresponding balance for a man. Thus, it's an equal protection violation. The court has never ruled that, by the way. That's not the reasoning that they used. They used the privacy reasoning.
Right, which was arguably wobbly, but people could agree on it, which is why
you can say it's wobbly, or, it's, at the very least, though, I think there's a place for, outside the legal journalism community, even in political journalism and the kinds of work that I do and that you did, to try to get into some of these more complicated things and sort of trust Americans that they can wrestle with complicated ideas. I want to approach our work assuming people aren't dumb. Seems a novel concept sometimes.
I want to move to this issue of voter suppression. Mm-hmm. You've been covering a wide swath of southern states, mm-hmm. And you know what happened in Georgia. And for those of you who don't, many southern states are getting younger, less white, more urban. Georgia has become a swing state. It gave Democrats the majority in the Senate with Jon Ossoff and Reverend Raphael Warnock. But right after, and I'd love for you to fill in the blanks here, right after those victories, and those victories were only possible because of massive voter registration efforts in the Black community. But nationally, since that time, more than 400 anti-voter bills have been introduced in 48 states. These bills erect barriers for people to register to vote by mail, or to vote in person. So my question to you, Bill, is, and since you cover this extensively, how will the new voter suppression laws and policies affect the outcome of the upcoming elections in the South, and how will they affect them nationally? Because the truth is, these voter suppression laws are not limited to the South.
Yeah. It's going to vary state to state because all the details are different. A couple of things, it is stripping away all of the most heated rhetoric from both parties. These laws are intended to make it harder for people to vote. That is inarguable. The push came from, aside from, there's a certain segment of the right that's been rattling these cages for a long time, but these laws ultimately got their juice from Donald Trump's false claims that the election was rigged or stolen or that there was massive fraud. That's absolutely true. It is also true that these laws in a lot of places, certainly the Georgia law, the final version that got passed, is a lot of more marginal changes here and there on the margins. So it's hard to know exactly how it's going to matter. Things like, before the state had not codified how many days of early voting the local offices actually had to be open. They hadn't codified the idea of drop boxes. That was more just by policy. And because of the pandemic, of course, there were huge numbers of drop boxes, particularly in the urban counties that trend heavily Democratic. There will not be, under these laws, another objectively true measure, there will not be as many drop boxes in those big, urban, huge Democratic counties. But it's also true we're not going to be in the middle of the pandemic. So will as many people want to vote from home? Because I live in a wealthy, upper middle class, upper class, racially mixed, but still clearly majority white neighborhood. I know plenty of people that use the drop boxes that voted absentee that never had before. It was certainly more convenient, but I also know people that just went downtown and voted. In Georgia, they used the football stadium as an early voting precinct. I voted at Mercedes-Benz Stadium in downtown. So there's just so many moving parts, and I'll give you I know that's a squishy answer, but I'll give a final answer this way. I asked some of Stacey Abrams' top people, the Democratic nominee for governor in 18, who's going to be the nominee again in 22. And I said, how is this going to work given that they passed it this early? I mean, clearly it changes the way you did things in 18 and 20, but they're giving you plenty of time. Will this keep you from winning the elections? And the Abrams folks were very clear. One, their answer is not meant in any way to mitigate the way they see these laws and the purposes. But they basically said, the truth is they gave us enough time that we'll just have to design our turnout model around it. They're going to make it more expensive because it's going to take more people to get folks. But they have the time to do it. And then there's another, and this is impossible to quantify, but it's just kind of something to pass on from sort of the ethos on the ground, is that black people in the United States, particularly in the South, particularly of an older generation, the ones that are old enough to remember before the Civil Rights Act and the years in which it was implemented, and those who were raised by parents and grandparents that lived through that, they know when white politicians are trying to make it harder for them to vote, and it really makes them mad. So in that way, and again, this is impossible, it's going to be impossible to quantify, but just the ethos, just on the mood on the ground is that, again, assuming people are not dumb, voters aren't stupid. They know when politicians are doing things and why they're doing them, and when it makes them mad, it can have an unintended consequence on the other way. So anyway, I don't know. That's a really meandering answer to say it's complicated, but there's just a lot of different variables.
Yeah. No, I actually watched your interview with Stacey Abrams. It was really interesting. Okay. Yeah. So I want to open up the floor to anyone here who has questions, and also to people in the live stream audience.
Hi, thank you so much for being here today. I really enjoyed what you said about nuance and complexity not being enemies to public discourse. though I feel that public discourse, there isn't much room for nuance and complexity in it right now. And my concerns with it are kind of twofold. First off is accessibility, and second of all is looking at who is considered to be in the electorate of discerning citizens. So how do we make nuance and complexity digestible and accessible to the lay American who may not have the educational resources that we have in this room? I think a lot of the times my concerns weigh in the fact that, we are at an Ivy League institution and a lot of us are very similar thinking minded and we're talking about these complex issues, but it's again what you said, we're not like out in the field. We're not voicing it or framing it in a way that is accessible to just the regular person. So yeah, that's my question.
Well, the first part is just not to inject so much of the oversimplification into the marketplace. Because under the idea that there's only so much oxygen in the room and so much of an attention span, the first step is for each of us that practice journalism from some vantage point to very consciously not use our work to just push what is not nuanced and does not honor complexity. That's the easier part. The harder part is what you acknowledge. I would say that when I think about just the value and the philosophy of honor, searching for nuance and complexity, and not being afraid of it, I'm not thinking necessarily about the longest form stuff. Clearly, it is easier to get into that when you're making a documentary, when you're writing a book, or even a New York Times Magazine cover story that people may not get to. That is true. That doesn't mean that you can't get, sometimes it could be as simple as a 500-word wire story becoming a 550-word wire story with a really good contextual graph that puts in a little history or adds another layer of complexity to a policy idea. Those are the kinds of things I'm talking about. This can be done at every point, even on Twitter, which can be such a cesspool. We have had the development of these threading apps, right? You can write, I see, professors do this a lot, like actual subject matter experts have learned to do this, where they're writing what amounts to like a 600 or 800 word essay, and you put it in an app and it separates it into 15 tweets and sends out the thread. And so it's actually using this medium that can be so awful and so ridiculous because it, quote, doesn't allow nuance, but lo and behold, smart people that know programming way above my pay grade figured out, yeah, you can even do nuance on Twitter. And I would push back just a little bit. Of course, out of 330 million people, we do have voters that do not have the means, either because of money or just generational and training gaps. The lack of high-speed internet access in rural areas. Like, we do have some barriers, but kind of check the numbers on what, and I don't want to minimize the lack of connectivity, but in a country where we have tens of millions of voters who of eligible voters who choose not to vote, I don't think we can assume that those people just aren't capable of engaging because of these barriers. I think plenty of them are. I think there's some other reason that we're not giving them something that meets a demand that they have, and we need to do a better job of figuring out what that is.
There was someone here who had his hand up. Yeah.
I'm, with your southern expertise, wondering about DeSantis in Florida and his efforts to break away from Trump, and just your observations about that and how that plays in a larger country.
Mm-hmm. He is, I've not covered DeSantis a lot myself, but I've been watching him for a while because I have seen him as someone that, and I don't like the prognostication game, but if Trump were to pass on the 2024 race, I think DeSantis would be a very, very strong contender for the Republican nomination. And I know that's not particularly profound to say at this point, but he is that model of Republican battleground state, knows how to do battleground campaigns, protects his right flank, has somehow figured out sort of how to do this dance with Trump. But then he's also and I need to be a little careful here because I haven't done the reporting, but he is Ivy League educated. Like DeSantis can run in a lot of circles. Does that make sense? He can speak a lot of different languages, and that makes him formidable. Now, if Trump runs, I have a hard time seeing under the Republican, this is where process gets important again. Like I outlined how the democratic process, the capital D democratic process actually works, and it's a delegate game, right? In the Republican rules, one, they have the same Southern stacked early calendar. So on Super Tuesday, very early in March, a whole bunch of Southern states vote. Trump swept those primaries in 2016. In several of them, he didn't get 40, 45% of the vote, but the Democrats have a more proportional distribution of delegates, which is why, for example, like that day that Biden pulled ahead of him and away from him, Bernie actually won California that day, but he didn't win California by enough. He got more delegates than Biden did, but not that many more. Biden gained, meanwhile, like Biden got, I think, all but one delegate in Alabama and all but one delegate in Mississippi or something like that. Like in Alabama and Mississippi alone, Biden netted more than what Bernie netted by winning California because of Democrats' distributional system of delegates. Republicans have a technically distributed, it's not winner take all that early, but it rewards just the outright statewide winner much more heavily. And then much earlier in the calendar, I can't remember when, maybe April 1st, but much earlier in the calendar than Democrats, Republicans go to a winner take all. And I think those rules for amassing delegates are important. It's why Trump was able to win in 2016, even though he was polling at 30 and 33%. And the media and his opponents kept saying, well, 70% of the party doesn't like him. Like, well, yeah, but there's 15 people running. And if he gets 50 and 55% of the delegates off of 30% of the vote, he's going to be the nominee, and that's what happened. So I just have a hard time believing that anybody can beat him in a Republican primary. I just don't see how it happens.
I think 2 more questions, and then we'll have to call it a day.
Thank you first for an excellent talk. You evoked Trump. Is it wishful thinking on my part, or are we likely to see a growing fatigue on the part of those who have been such ardent supporters of Donald Trump by the time we get to 2024? Tell me that. Give me.
I
Give me help.
probably need to in my job, if I'm going to honor what I said, my notebook is empty for 2024. I have the history and experience that I have. I can tell you that he maintains a real hold on a not insignificant segment of the American population. But elections are close. The 3 states that tilted the Electoral College to him, I think his cumulative margin was 78,000 votes, 80,000 votes. For Biden, who won the popular vote by more than 7 million, that number was about 42,000 in Georgia, Wisconsin, and Arizona. That's what it's going to look like again because of the system. We have to understand just the structural rules. And so can there be some fatigue? We know from evidence from 2016 to 2020 there was fatigue. Biden got some votes that Trump got in 2016. But this thing turns on the margins. Could he get reelected losing the popular vote by 6 or 7 million? Yeah, he almost did in 2020.
God has to love the Electoral College. Yes, up there, and then down here, and then we're done.
Hi, thanks. As you pointed out, the actual sort of team red, team blue phrasing is sort of new, but I wondered, do we really have a heyday of lots of nuance and complexity? And if we did, how did we get away from it? And if we didn't, is it just that it got worse with the internet and the bubbles and such sort of? I thought you could address that a little bit.
Yeah, some of the students asked about that earlier today. It's been a while since I've read a press history book on White House coverage, for example, but in my recollection, kind of this modern era of what we consider the White House press corps sort of dates back to the FDR administration, where a bunch of the same reporters worked at the White House every day and had sort of a dedicated staff member that now we would call the press secretary, and they had pretty regular access to the president. And I think horse race journalism and who's up, who's down, and just the fun part of the race has always been a part of that. And to some degree, always will be. And let me be clear, I like politics, like for the fun part of it. I do like that.
And you like horse racing too?
I've been to a Kentucky Derby. It's the coolest sporting event I've ever been to.
Okay.
I think like where my passion in this and frustration comes from, it isn't necessarily thinking that we had this grand, wonderful yesteryear where everybody sat down and read the newspaper cover to cover and thought in depth about every issue. It's more that I feel like we're just wasting this information age where, I mean, the access that we have online to so many sources, good, bad, and ugly, it's out there. It's not that connectivity issues remain. There are a segment of the population for whom it is still a challenge, but it's just the mediums that we have available to us individually and collectively in this democracy, in this profession, and for it to develop this way over my lifetime is just incongruent to me. So I don't know that there's like a past model I would want to point to, and I think that's dangerous anyway, because you just don't go back with systems build on themselves. We have to, I mean, it's why some of the ideas I offer are kind of esoteric and at the margins, and you know, the best idea, best hope that I have in putting it together this way is that they will build on themselves and become a journalism equivalent of compound interest. It's not a wholesale revolution that just throws everything off the desk and builds a new system, because that's not the way this works.
One final question, then one final thought from Bill.
Thank you. Well, I had a brief comment and a very short question. About the nuance and complexity. It seems to me that it's not just the, of course there's access and there's education and all of that, but I also had, like, in my own family, you know, I shared an interview with Noam Chomsky, but it wasn't a scholarly interview. And he's like, just the way that is written is, you know, like, I think there's like ideological resistance sometimes. Mm-hmm. So what you said about Twitter, that's brilliant, because it's actually like putting it in you know, plain language, but again, a minority of the people are on Twitter, right? But I think that's something. And then back to the Republicans. If Trump decides, I know you don't want to prognosticate, but the way the Republican Party has been hijacked, like if he decides to run, will there even be a primary? Like, would anyone dare to run?
Yeah, I would. This is almost me as a reader talking here again, because part of Nieman is that you spend a year not working and not calling your sources. But there seems to be some noise from some of these more moderate, you know, what we might call these old Chamber of Commerce Republicans, that someone would stand up, you know, maybe one of these governors, and be willing to be, I mean, almost certainly be a sacrificial lamb, but again, to engage, to force the conversation, to force there to be an argument that voters have to consider, that we have to cover. And I would just hope, I am comfortable saying this is citizen me, but also reporter me, and this is not about Trump. It would be one more damning chapter for the state of American democracy if the party seeking to win the White House back doesn't have a contested primary. That's just not the way this system is supposed to work.
All right, I think we're going to end it right there. Thank you so much, Bill.
All right, thank you.